Everyone in Terminal 5 security zone knew one rule: stay away from the handler. Terry Barton's massive Rottweiler had terrorized trained handlers, snapped industrial-grade chains, and sent security personnel scrambling for cover. No one could get within 10 feet without risking serious injury. Not even Barton himself. So when a tiny girl in a bright pink dress wandered past the security checkpoint one afternoon, the entire terminal froze. The handler's head snapped up. His growl rumbled through the polished floors. Security guards reached for their radios. Staff shouted for her to stop, but the little girl didn't run. She didn't panic. She just knelt down and whispered something no one else could hear. The handler stopped growling. His ears shifted forward. And then, in a moment that made every hardened security operative take a step back, the beast everyone feared slowly lowered himself and placed his massive head gently in her lap. Terry Barton watched from behind the glass partition, stunned. He'd crushed rival operations, intimidated entire networks, seen enemies fall, but he had never seen his dog submit to anyone, especially not a child. What she did next shocked the entire security team and revealed a secret about the handler no one, not even the crime boss, ever knew. Stay with me until the end, because what this little girl reveals about the Rottweiler will change everything you think you know about loyalty. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The baggage claim corridor of the major metropolitan airport stretched across thousands of square feet of sterile tile and reinforced security barriers, monitored by dozens of cameras that tracked every passenger, every movement. Inside this fortress of protocols and procedures, stainless steel conveyor belts hummed beneath fluorescent lights, and security checkpoints formed a maze that had processed more contraband and suspicious characters than most people could imagine. But none of those threats were as dangerous as the one that occupied the restricted security holding area. Terry Barton had built his underground empire on intimidation, control, and an iron fist that never showed weakness. His name alone made rivals reconsider their strategies. Officials overlooked certain irregularities. Competing networks knew better than to encroach on his territory. Yet, there was one creature in his operation that Terry himself couldn't command. The handler had entered Barton's possession 3 years earlier, a gift from a business contact who thought the notorious security operator needed better deterrence. The enormous Rottweiler weighed 120 pounds of pure muscle and possessed a temperament that matched his owner's reputation for ruthlessness. From the beginning, the handler proved impossible to control. The first professional handler lasted barely an hour before the handler cornered him against the security fence, snarling with such intensity that the man refused to return even for his final paycheck. The second handler managed 2 shifts before the handler tore through a reinforced steel core leash like it was thread and drove him from the premises. By the time the 5th handler quit, rumors had spread throughout the private security network. The handler wasn't just aggressive, he was unhinged. The dog destroyed equipment, damaged expensive surveillance gear, and once bit clean through a metal feed bowl when a technician made too sudden a movement during feeding time. His bark could clear entire corridors. His growl sent chills through operatives who had faced down armed suspects without flinching. Even Terry kept his distance. The crime boss had tried everything. Heavy sedatives that barely dulled the handler's edge. Shock systems that the dog somehow learned to anticipate and avoid. Elite animal specialists who examined the Rottweiler and tripled their consulting rates only to resign within 48 hours. Nothing worked. The handler occupied his reinforced holding pen like a warlord ruling over a kingdom of fear. The security staff developed complicated shift patterns just to avoid working near his area. New hires received strict warnings about the restricted zone. Visiting associates were discreetly directed to alternative routes. The dog had become Terry's most humiliating weakness. Here was a man who controlled operations across the eastern seaboard, who commanded networks of loyal enforcers, who could eliminate problems with a single encrypted message. Yet, he couldn't tame one Rottweiler. But Terry couldn't bring himself to remove the handler from his operation either. Terry Barton's operation stretched across 12 major airports on the eastern seaboard, a shadow network that moved everything the authorities weren't supposed to know about. His security contractors wore legitimate uniforms, carried official credentials, and blended seamlessly into the everyday chaos of American air travel. Nobody questioned them. Nobody dared. Barton had spent 15 years building this empire, cultivating relationships with the right officials, ensuring the wrong questions never got asked. His organization processed millions in contraband annually, all hidden beneath the veneer of routine security protocols. One phone call from Terry could reroute entire shipments. One encrypted message could make problems disappear permanently. Rival operations had learned the hard way that challenging Barton meant losing access to the most lucrative transportation corridors in the country. Yet for all his power, for all his meticulous control over every detail of his vast criminal enterprise, Terry Barton couldn't manage his own guard dog. The handler represented everything Barton built his reputation on: intimidation, raw power, absolute dominance. The Rottweiler should have been the perfect symbol of his operation. Instead, the dog had become his most closely guarded embarrassment. During high-level meetings, Barton watched business associates flinch at the distant sound of the handler's barking echoing through the terminal corridors. He saw the knowing smirks from rivals who'd heard the stories. The great Terry Barton, who commanded respect through fear, reduced to avoiding entire sections of his own facility because of an animal he couldn't control. The handler's history read like a catalog of destruction. In his first month, he demolished a reinforced kennel that cost $12,000, bending steel bars that were rated to contain animals twice his size. He'd hospitalized 2 professional handlers, one requiring 17 stitches after the handler tore through his protective gear, another suffering a fractured wrist when the dog yanked him off his feet and dragged him 15 yards across concrete. The Rottweiler had destroyed 4 industrial leashes, each one supposedly unbreakable, snapping them like cheap rope the moment he decided he'd had enough restraint. Security footage showed the handler attacking his own water bowl with such ferocity that he dented the stainless steel beyond recognition, simply because a maintenance worker had placed it 6 inches from its usual spot. Terry had brought in specialists from 3 different states. Military dog trainers who'd worked with special forces animals. Behaviorists who commanded $500 an hour. Even a handler who claimed to have tamed aggressive dogs for cartel operations in Mexico. The handler had defeated them all, his reputation growing more terrifying with each failed attempt to break his will. Maggie Kane had been holding her guardian's hand when the crowd surged around the baggage carousel. One moment she felt the familiar warmth of fingers wrapped around hers. The next she was adrift in a sea of rushing legs and rolling suitcases. She called out, but her small voice disappeared into the chaos of announcements, conversations, and the mechanical hum of conveyor belts. Travelers streamed past without noticing the tiny girl in the bright pink dress with a cartoon cat on the front, each person absorbed in their own urgent destination. The panic started small, a flutter in her chest that reminded her of the feeling she'd had at her parents' funeral 3 months ago. That same sense of being lost in a world suddenly too big, too loud, too fast. She turned in circles, searching for a familiar face, her blonde hair catching the harsh fluorescent light as airport security began mobilizing around the terminal. Staff members spoke urgently into radios. A woman's voice crackled over the intercom about a missing child. But Maggie barely registered any of it. Through a gap in the crowd, past the restricted access signs and yellow caution tape, she saw him. The massive Rottweiler sat in the shadows of the security holding area, his dark form barely visible behind the chain-link reinforcement. Most people would have seen a monster. Most children would have run screaming. But Maggie had learned something in the 3 months since losing her parents. She'd learned to recognize pain in others because she carried so much of it herself. The dog's posture struck her immediately. The way he sat so still, so isolated, separated from everything and everyone. The way his massive head hung low despite his intimidating size. The way he existed in that space like he was waiting for something that would never come. While security personnel rushed past her, radios crackling with alerts about the missing child, while her guardian's frantic voice echoed somewhere in the distance, Maggie took 3 slow steps toward the restricted area. A maintenance worker spotted her and shouted a warning. 2 security guards started moving in her direction. But Maggie's focus remained locked on the Rottweiler. She tilted her head, studying him with the peculiar wisdom that grief sometimes grants the young, and whispered words that no one else in that chaotic terminal could hear. He looks lonely. If you believe people should be treated with kindness, not fear, hit subscribe. Only those who use intimidation won't. The security guards were looking in the wrong direction. They'd fanned out toward the main concourse, assuming a lost child would gravitate toward the bright shops and food courts, toward the noise and the crowds where most frightened children instinctively sought help. They didn't consider that Maggie Kane wasn't running toward people. She was moving toward the one creature in the entire terminal that understood what it meant to be alone. She ducked under the caution tape with the fluid ease of a child who'd grown accustomed to making herself small, to slipping through spaces where adults weren't watching. The restricted access door stood slightly ajar, propped open by a maintenance cart someone had abandoned during the chaos of the search. Maggie squeezed through the gap, her pink dress a splash of color against the gray concrete and industrial fixtures of the baggage handling corridor. The sounds of the terminal faded behind her, replaced by the mechanical grinding of conveyor systems and the hollow echo of her small footsteps on polished concrete. The holding area stretched before her like a forgotten corner of the airport's underbelly. Harsh utility lights cast sharp shadows across reinforced kennels and storage cages. Security equipment lined the walls, confiscated items, monitoring stations, the infrastructure that passengers never saw. And there, in the far corner behind a barrier of chain-link fencing and warning signs, the handler lay motionless on the cold floor. Maggie took another step forward. Then another. The distance between them collapsed from 20 feet to 15, from 15 to 10. She could see him clearly now, the powerful muscles beneath his dark coat, the scars that marked his muzzle and neck like a map of violence, the chain that tethered him to a reinforced anchor point in the concrete floor. Her small shoes made almost no sound, but some instinct, some primal awareness that comes from years of hypervigilance, alerted the Rottweiler to her presence. The handler's eyes snapped open. In that instant, every muscle in his massive body went rigid. His head lifted with predatory precision, ears rotating forward to lock onto the source of the intrusion. The low growl that emerged from deep in his chest wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the sound of contained violence, of barely restrained aggression, a frequency that resonated through the concrete floor and up through Maggie's small frame. The warning was unmistakable and absolute. She had crossed into the danger zone, and there was no one close enough to pull her back. The handler rose to his full height, and in the confined space of the holding area, he seemed impossibly large. His shoulders bunched with coiled power as he shifted his weight forward, the chain attached to his collar pulling taut with a metallic scrape against concrete. His lips curled back in a snarl that exposed teeth designed by nature for one purpose, to tear through flesh and crush bone with hydraulic force. Every professional who'd attempted to handle this dog had seen this exact display, this moment before the violence erupted, and every single one of them had retreated or paid the price for hesitation. Maggie froze. Not from fear, but from recognition. She'd spent 3 months learning to decode the language of suffering, sitting through countless nights when grief manifested as anger, when loss expressed itself through rage at a world that kept spinning despite unbearable pain. She'd heard her aunt sob in the next room with sounds that started as crying but transformed into something rawer, more primal. She'd felt her own small body shake with emotions too big for a 7-year-old to process, feelings that came out sideways because there was no proper place for them to go. The handler's growl intensified, vibrating through the air between them, but Maggie heard something beneath the aggression. The same frequency she'd heard in her own voice when she'd screamed at her guardian that she hated everyone, when what she really meant was that she hurt so much she couldn't breathe. The same tone that had escaped her throat at the funeral when anger felt safer than admitting how terrified and lost she truly was. "You're hurting," she whispered, her voice steady despite the massive predator tensed before her. "Like my parents were hurting." The words hung in the stale air of the holding area, impossibly fragile against the backdrop of the handler's threatening posture. For a moment, nothing changed. The dog remained locked in his aggressive stance, muscles trembling with barely contained violence, teeth still bared in warning. But then something shifted in his dark eyes. The growl that had been building toward explosion faltered, stuttering like an engine losing power. His ears, pinned flat against his skull in pure aggression, twitched with uncertainty. Maggie took the smallest step forward, her pink dress swaying gently. "Someone hurt you before you could tell them to stop," she continued, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that pain often wore anger's mask. "That's why you're so scared." The handler's growl died completely, replaced by something that sounded almost like confusion. Maggie took another step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate. When she reached a spot just outside the range of the handler's chain, she did something that defied every survival instinct, every rule of self-preservation. She lowered herself to the cold concrete floor, carefully arranging her pink dress around her crossed legs, and sat down as if settling in for story time at the library. The handler's massive head tracked her movement, his confusion deepening with each second that passed without the expected retreat, without the fear he'd come to expect from every human who entered his space. "My mommy and daddy went away," Maggie said softly, her small voice carrying across the distance between them. "They didn't want to leave me, but sometimes bad things happen and nobody can stop them. I was really, really angry for a long time. I broke my favorite toy because I wanted someone to know how much it hurt inside." She paused, studying the scars on the Rottweiler's muzzle with eyes too old for her young face. "I think someone did bad things to you too. Things that hurt so much you didn't know how to tell anyone except by being angry." The handler's breath came in short, uncertain huffs. His weight shifted from one front paw to the other, the aggressive stance wavering like a wall developing cracks. Maggie tilted her head, offering him the gentlest of smiles, the kind that held no demands, no expectations, just simple presence. "My aunt says sometimes people just need someone to sit with them when they're sad," she continued. "She sits with me even when I'm being mean because I don't know how to say I'm scared." Maggie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Would you like me to sit with you?" The rigid tension that had defined the handler's posture for 3 years, the coiled violence, the permanent state of threatened aggression, began to ease. His shoulders lowered incrementally. The trembling in his muscles shifted from predatory readiness to something else entirely, something that looked almost like exhaustion from carrying so much anger for so long. From the observation window 50 feet away, Terry Barton stood frozen beside 3 security personnel, his phone halfway to his ear, the emergency call to animal control forgotten. His hand had been reaching for the panic button, his mind calculating response times and damage control. But now he simply stood, watching something he'd never witnessed in 3 years of owning this animal. The security team didn't move, didn't speak, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever impossible thing was unfolding in that holding area. Comment, "I stand for compassion" if you can't stand people like Terry Barton who rule by fear. The handler took one tentative step forward, then stopped, as if testing whether this small human would finally reveal herself to be like all the others, deceptive, threatening, capable of sudden violence disguised as care. But Maggie remained perfectly still, her breathing slow and steady, her posture open and unthreatening. The Rottweiler took another step, the chain dragging across concrete with a sound that had become the soundtrack to his isolated existence. In the better light, Maggie could see what the shadows had hidden. The handler's dark coat bore the testimony of a brutal history written in scar tissue and damaged fur. Around his muzzle, pale lines crisscrossed the black and tan markings, evidence of muzzles that had been strapped too tight, removed too roughly, applied with hands that viewed him as a weapon to be maintained rather than a living creature capable of suffering. His neck showed deeper marks, places where chains had rubbed fur away down to the skin, where collars had been cinched with such force that the tissue had never properly healed. Maggie had seen similar scars, though not on animals. She'd seen them on the arms of her mother's friend who'd visited the hospital, track marks and cigarette burns that told stories the woman never spoke aloud. She'd learned that some wounds were visible while others lived deeper, in places no doctor could stitch or bandage could cover. "Someone was very mean to you before you came here," Maggie whispered, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. The handler's ears swiveled toward her, catching every syllable. "They hurt you when you were just trying to be good. They made you think nobody would ever be kind." The Rottweiler stood less than 6 feet away now, close enough that Maggie could see the amber flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to count each ragged breath that escaped his scarred muzzle. His massive head tilted slightly, processing her words, searching for the trap he'd been conditioned to expect. But there was no trap. There was only a small girl in a pink dress who'd learned that the world could be cruel and still chose gentleness. Maggie slowly extended her right hand, palm up, fingers relaxed and open. Not reaching toward him, not demanding contact, just offering. The gesture held no expectation of reciprocation, no hidden agenda, no timeline or urgency. It was simply an invitation, freely given, easily declined. Permission to trust again, if he could find the courage. Permission to believe that not every hand that reached toward him came bearing pain. The handler stared at her outstretched palm, his entire body trembling with the impossibility of the choice before him. Time seemed to suspend itself in that holding area, each second stretching impossibly long as the handler wrestled with 3 years of conditioning that screamed at him to attack, to defend, to never trust again. His muscles quivered with the effort of overriding instincts that had been beaten into him in dark places, where kindness was a weapon used to create vulnerability. But something in Maggie's unwavering presence, in the patient stillness of her outstretched hand, spoke a language older than his trauma, a dialect of connection that predated the cruelty humans had taught him. The handler's massive head lowered. Moving with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a creature of such power, with a gentleness that contradicted every violent act in his history, he stretched his scarred neck forward. The movement was achingly slow, each inch of progress a victory over the programming that insisted touch meant pain. His wet nose made contact with Maggie's small palm, and for the first time in 3 years, the handler chose to be vulnerable. He pressed into her hand, not with force, but with the tentative hope of something broken, testing whether it might still be capable of being whole. Behind the observation glass, Terry Barton felt something crack inside his chest. The sensation was physical, visceral, like ice breaking after a long winter. He'd built his empire on the belief that emotion was weakness, that connection was a liability to be exploited in others and eliminated in himself. But watching this impossible moment, watching a child offer tenderness to a creature everyone feared, something ancient and buried stirred in his carefully constructed armor. His own daughter would have been Maggie's age now if cancer hadn't stolen her 6 years ago. He'd locked that grief away, sealed it behind walls of ambition and ruthlessness, convinced himself that shutting down was survival. But this small girl in a pink dress had just demonstrated something he'd forgotten, that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't domination, but trust. Maggie's face lit with a smile that held no triumph, only quiet joy. She kept her hand steady, allowing the handler to press deeper into her palm, his entire massive body relaxing into the contact like someone finally laying down a burden they'd carried too long. Once upon a time, she began softly, her free hand reaching up to gently stroke the scarred fur behind his ear. There was a very brave creature who'd been hurt by people who didn't understand him. Everyone thought he was dangerous, but really he was just lonely and scared. He spent his days protecting himself because no one had ever protected him. Don't let the algorithms win. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about good defeating evil. Terry Barton didn't sleep that night. While Maggie was reunited with her frantic guardian and escorted safely out of the terminal, while his security team filed incident reports that would never see official channels, he sat in his office making phone calls to contacts who specialized in information others wanted buried. The miracle he'd witnessed demanded explanation. Dogs didn't transform from unhinged weapons to gentle companions in the span of minutes. Not without history. Not without reason. The first call went to the associate who'd gifted him the handler 3 years ago, a conversation that started cordial and ended with thinly veiled threats when the man proved reluctant to discuss the dog's origins. The second call reached a veterinarian who worked exclusively with underground operations, a woman who kept meticulous records precisely because her client's activities required deniability. The third call connected him to a handler from a disbanded protection circuit in Baltimore, someone who remembered a Rottweiler so violent he'd been passed between operators like a curse no one wanted to inherit. By 3 a.m, Terry had assembled a timeline that made his blood run cold. The handler hadn't started with him. The dog had been bred and trained by a smaller operation that ran high-stakes protection details for clients who couldn't afford official scrutiny. The training had been brutal, systematic abuse designed to create a weapon capable of extreme violence on command. But even the most hardened operators had discovered a problem. The handler's aggression, once triggered, became uncontrollable. He'd attack indiscriminately, unable to distinguish between threat and bystander, his trauma-driven rage impossible to redirect. Except for one person. A small girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old at the time, whose parents had been part of the operation's logistics network. The child had somehow recognized what everyone else missed, that the handler's violence was panic given physical form, pain expressing itself the only way the dog knew how. She'd spent hours sitting with him between assignments, speaking softly, offering the one thing no one in that brutal world had ever given him: compassion without agenda. The girl's name was Margaret Kane. Maggie. Her parents had died 4 months ago in a traffic accident that Terry's sources confirmed bore the fingerprints of organized crime. A message sent, a debt collected, collateral damage in a world where innocence provided no protection. The reunion in his terminal hadn't been chance. It had been recognition. 2 souls who'd survived the same violent machinery of the criminal underworld, finding each other again in the one moment when both needed saving. 3 days later, Terminal 5 Security Zone operated under new protocols that Terry Barton's staff didn't fully understand, but knew better than to question. The handler no longer occupied the isolated holding area in the basement corridors. Instead, the massive Rottweiler could be found lying peacefully near Gate 47, his scarred head resting on his paws, his dark eyes tracking the flow of passengers with calm alertness rather than aggression. The transformation had been so complete that travelers occasionally stopped to ask if they could pet the airport's therapy dog, a question that made veteran security personnel exchange bewildered glances. Maggie visited twice a week, brought by her guardian who'd struck an arrangement with Barton that neither party discussed in detail. The little girl would sit cross-legged beside the handler, reading books aloud or simply talking about her day, and the dog would press close to her side with a gentleness that seemed impossible given his history. Staff members who'd once refused to work shifts near the Rottweiler now volunteered for gate assignments where they could witness the ongoing miracle of his rehabilitation. Terry Barton watched these visits from various vantage points throughout the terminal, maintaining his distance, but unable to stay away entirely. The revelation about Maggie and the handler's shared past had fundamentally altered something in his understanding of power. For 15 years, he'd built an empire on a simple philosophy: loyalty could be purchased through fear, control maintained through intimidation, respect commanded through the threat of consequences. Every relationship in his organization functioned as a transaction: protection for obedience, profit for silence, survival for submission. But the handler had exposed the flaw in that philosophy. The dog had spent 3 years under Barton's control, fed and housed and theoretically cared for, yet had remained a weapon pointed at everyone, including his owner. 1 hour with a 7-year-old girl who asked for nothing, who offered only understanding and compassion, had accomplished what 3 years of dominance never could. The handler's loyalty to Maggie wasn't bought or coerced. It was freely given, a choice made possible because she'd seen him as something worth saving rather than something to be controlled. Barton gathered his senior staff in his office one evening and delivered an order in a tone that invited no discussion. "What happened with the girl and the dog? It stays here. Anyone asks, we had a security incident that was resolved internally. No reports, no rumors, no stories leave this terminal. Understood? We're fighting against negativity in the comments. Hit subscribe and join the positive side. Like this video if you agree that every creature, no matter how tough, deserves love."